It's always risky to speak outside of your own field of expertise, but when you mess up the mathematics so badly that even a cartoon bear can point out your mistakes, it's time to take a step back and rethink a few things. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. And last time we wrapped up our discussion of premise one of his Kalam cosmological argument, which says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And naturally, this premise skips over the equally true and necessary observation that everything that begins to exist is also a transformation of pre-existing material. He's trying to sneak in an unjustified assumption that supernatural causes can bring things into existence out of nothing. And if we include all of the relevant real-world observations, premise one won't let him do that. Now, if I was Dr. Craig, I reckon my response to that would be to say, well, hey, ain't you doing the same thing by assuming that supernatural causes can't create something out of nothing? But no, I ain't making that assumption. I was just pointing out that we ain't actually examined everything that begins to exist to see if it has a cause or not. That's just a generalization based on what we observe in objective reality. And what we observe in objective reality is that things is transformations of pre-existing material by processes that obeys the laws of physics. And that don't give us no basis for claiming that some things has supernatural causes that bring them into existence in the absence of pre-existing material. So if we don't inject any unjustified assumptions into premise one, the most we can say for sure is that we know things has both a cause and some kind of pre-existing material. Now, if you want to include anything more than that, you're going to have to demonstrate it first. Anyways, today we're going to move on to premise two, which states that the universe began to exist. And that's going to be a tricky proposition on account of time is a dimension of the material universe, which means that the material universe has existed for all of time. In order for the material universe not to exist, there'd have to be a time when time did not exist. And that's a self-contradiction, which makes it kind of tricky when you want to talk about the universe beginning to exist. There's an earliest moment of time, of course, but the universe was already existing at that time, which is why time itself existed at that point. So is that really a beginning, or is that just a consequence of time being finite in the past? Well, let's see how Dr. Craig's going to try and convince us that the universe had an actual beginning. And he's going to start with a couple philosophical arguments. Quote, first philosophical argument, an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. Ghazali argued that if the universe never began to exist, then there must have been an infinite number of past events prior to today. But, he argued, an infinite number of things cannot exist. End quote. So right off the bat, he's making an appeal to personal incredulity, as we'll see when he gets into trying to argue in favor of this point. But more than that, he's making an argument that's going to come back and bite him in the butt, big time. And it's all a moot point because we don't need an infinite past in order for the universe to have existed for all of time. All we need is for there never to have been a time when the universe did not exist. And that's easier if in the past is finite. We ain't got to fill up the past with an infinite series of past events. We can fill up all of time so far with only about 13.8 billion years worth of past events. And that's a lot less effort, so to speak. Anyways, let's hear his justification for the claim that an infinite number of things can't exist. Quote, Ghazali argued that if an actually infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. If we're to avoid the absurdities, then we must deny that an actually infinite number of things exist. End quote. Or, hear me out here, the mathematics of infinity is counterintuitive because we're prone to treat infinity as if it was a really big, finite number, and it ain't. Ghazali died over 600 years before the birth of Georg Cantor and the development of the mathematical techniques that allow us to work with infinities, so I reckon it ain't too surprising that Ghazali would just give up and call infinity absurd as soon as he ran into any of the counterintuitive aspects of it. And it ain't too surprising that an apologist would take advantage of the counterintuitive nature of infinity in order to fool his audience into thinking that he's proved that infinity can't exist. But now here's where Dr. Craig's argument comes back to bite him in the posterior. Quote, that means that the number of past events cannot be actually infinite. Therefore, the universe cannot be beginningless. Rather, the universe began to exist. End quote. And notice, this is not an argument from the nature of the universe, it's an argument from the nature of past events. And that means it applies to God just as much as it does to the universe. In order for God to be from everlasting to everlasting, like it says in the Bible, they would have to be an infinite number of past events in his experience. And according to this argument, that ain't possible. And the nature of God ain't got nothing to do with it. The nature of past events is such that an infinite number of them can't exist, according to Ghazali, and therefore God can't be beginningless neither. So good job, Dr. Craig. You just done proved that the Bible is wrong when it claims that God has existed forever in the past. Dr. Craig goes on to dismiss the modern mathematics of infinite sets by declaring that it's basically theoretical and that even though, for example, the set of all positive integers might be infinite, the integers themselves don't physically exist. He ain't arguing that we can't have conceptual infinities. He's just arguing that they can't be any actual infinities. But of course, this is just an appeal to personal incredulity. There ain't no logical reason why actual infinities can't exist, and in fact, I would argue that the circumference of every circle is technically infinite in that it ain't got no beginning nor end. I know by convention we measure the length of the circumference by going round the circle until we get back to the point we started from, but that's just a convention. There ain't no physical end in there, and you can keep on going round and round the curve as long as you want. It ain't got no finite end. And if you really want to boggle your mind, consider that the number of points in a circle is the same no matter how big the circle is. And you can prove that by drawing a couple concentric circles. Draw a line from any point on the outer circle to the center, and it will intersect the inner circle at exactly 1 point. No 2 points on the outer circle ever maps to a single point on the inner circle, because if it did, at least one of the lines would not be a straight line. So every point on the outer circle maps 1-to-1 to a single point on the inner circle. The number of points in both circles is exactly the same. And it don't matter how big the outer circle gets. There's still a 1-to-1 correspondence there. So yeah, the mathematics of infinity is counterintuitive, and if you want to fool folks into thinking infinities is absurd, you got lots of examples of the counterintuitive nature of infinity. But that ain't a disproof of infinity, because if an infinities was wrong, the math wouldn't work. And I'm going to skip on ahead a bit because Dr. Craig goes into a long, detailed discussion of Hilbert's Hotel, trying to stimulate folks' personal incredulity. And yeah, honestly, I can't deny that this is an effective way to fool folks who ain't got a whole lot of background in mathematics. But since the past is actually finite anyway, this whole discussion's basically irrelevant, so I'm just going to skip on ahead. Dr. Craig's next argument, which he borrows from Al-Ghazali, is based on a false assumption. Quote, second philosophical argument. You can't pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. The series of past events, Ghazali observes, has been formed by adding one event after another. The series of past events is like a sequence of dominoes falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. But, he argues, no series that is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite, for you cannot pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. End quote. And the assumption here is that you started at the first domino and counted all the infinite number of dominoes between the first domino and the last one. Intuitively, we tend to assume that an infinite series has a beginning, but that only works going forwards from some first domino to an infinite series. If you're going backwards trying to get to the first domino, you got a problem because they ain't no first domino. That's what infinite means. So if there was an infinite series of past events, it ain't going to be possible to start at the far end because it don't end. Necessarily, you're going to have to start somewhere in the middle. And if you start from some fixed point in the middle, you're only going to have a finite number of dominoes to count before you get to today's domino. So in a way, Al-Ghazali is right that you can't start from the beginning of a beginningless series, but on the other hand, there's no logical reason why you'd have to start from the beginning. It's like measuring the circumference of a circle. You can start from any point you want and go around until you get to the same point again and keep on going. Whatever point you pick ain't going to be the actual first or last point of the circle because it don't actually start nor end there. But any one point you pick is going to be just as good as any other. Also, the only way an infinite number of past events could exist is if in each and every one of those events was an event. And what's an event? An event is a change in conditions between one point in time and some subsequent point in time. And time is a dimension of the material universe. So we don't need to go through an infinite series of past events to get to material universe because a material universe is required in order to have the events. By the time you have an infinite series of events, you already have a material universe in some form. And there ain't no logical nor philosophical reason why one of those events can't be today. It has to be something or else it wouldn't be an event. And today is just as good as something as any. So anyways, let's look at what Dr. Craig thinks is some potential objections to his argument. Quote, some critics have responded that every event in the past is only a finite distance from the present. This objection commits a logical fallacy called the fallacy of composition. This is the fallacy of confusing a property of a part with the property of the whole. End quote. And for a good example of a composition fallacy, see Dr. Craig's defense of premise 1, where he argues that because things in the universe has causes, the universe as a whole must also be caused. Textbook case of a composition fallacy. But that ain't what's going on when mathematicians describe the traversability of an infinite series. I think maybe Dr. Craig is getting confused between philosophical logic and mathematical proofs and set theory. And we can see this confusion in his discussion of the math. Quote, compare the series of negative numbers. -3, -2, -1, 0. It's beginningless. Nevertheless, any number you pick, say -11 or -1,000,000 or whatever, is only a finite distance from 0. But the finite distance from any past event to the present is easily crossed, just as you can count down to 0 from any negative number you pick. End quote. And notice he says you can get to 0 by counting down from a negative number. But starting with a negative number and counting down moves you further away from 0. You have to count up to 0 if and you starting from a negative number. And okay, that's a trivial mistake that any non-mathematician might be likely to make. But I think it helps illustrate the fact that Dr. Craig is talking outside of his field when he tries to apply the principles of logic in the philosophical sense to the field of mathematics. The traversability of a set of integers ain't the property of the individual integers in the set. The number -3 all by itself ain't traversable. So we ain't taking the properties of a part and applying it to the whole. Traversability is a property of the whole. And it ain't a composition fallacy to use the properties of the whole to describe the whole. So that one was a swing and a miss. There ain't no rule in math or logic that says a series can't be infinite, and all Dr. Craig really has on his side is a simple appeal to personal incredulity. So he goes back to catalog some more of the counterintuitive stuff you run into when he's working with infinities. Quote, Suppose that for every one orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. If they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter. End quote. And that's a peculiar example. The way he says it makes it sound like he's saying Jupiter and Saturn ends up infinitely far apart. But of course, since they's both in elliptical orbits around a common center, they's never going to get more than a certain distance apart before they starts approaching each other again. But whatever point he thought he was making with that argument, he tries to reinforce it with this one. Quote, suppose Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Which will have completed the most orbits? The answer is that the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. End quote. Which is exactly true, even though it's counterintuitive. The number of positive integers is infinity, and the number of positive even integers is also infinity, even though you'd expect there to be twice as many integers as there is even integers. That don't mean that there's no such thing as integers or even integers. That just means that our intuitive sense of how infinity ought to work ain't reliable. Well, apparently Dr. Craig wants his audience to think that counterintuitive means not possible. And just to prove that mathematics ain't a field he's particularly qualified in, he says this, quote, don't let someone try to slip out of this argument by saying infinity is not a number. In modern mathematics, it is a number. The number of elements in the set, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. End quote. And first of all, ain't no argument here to slip out of. Infinities is counterintuitive. Okay, yes, we know that, but it'd be a non sequitur to conclude that because they's counterintuitive, they's necessarily false somehow. Secondly, modern mathematicians will tell you that infinity is not, in fact, a number, at least in the everyday sense of the term number. In the everyday sense, if you add two positive numbers together, you get a bigger number. But infinity don't work that way. Infinity may be the number of elements in the set 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, but it's also the number of elements in the set 0, 2, 4, 6, and so on, and the set 0, 3, 6, 9, and so on. It seems like the first infinity ought to be bigger than the other two, but it ain't. And that's just a few examples of countable infinities. There's other infinities that ain't even countable. So clearly, Dr. Craig is trying to exploit most folks' ignorance of advanced mathematics to try and fool them into thinking he's proved something that he ain't actually proved. And on the one hand, maybe he don't know no better, being as he spent all his time studying philosophy instead of advanced math. But on the other hand, he ought to know that he don't know no better, especially when he's had qualified mathematicians try to explain to him how he's getting it wrong. And he's made enough references to folks raising mathematical objections to his arguments that it's safe to say he's been corrected on this. So I'm letting him off the hook for this one. Now, his last example is kind of subtle, and it might even sound pretty conclusive to a non-mathematician. Quote, suppose we meet someone who claims to have been counting down from eternity past and is now finishing. -3, -2, -1, 0. Whew. Well, why, we may ask, is he just finishing his countdown today? Why didn't he finish yesterday or the day before? After all, by then an infinite amount of time had already passed. So if the man were counting at a rate of 1 number per second, he's already had an infinite number of seconds to finish his countdown. End quote. Well, that sounds plausible, don't it? Problem here is that counting from infinity don't work the way we intuitively think it ought to. Counting means you take a number and add 1 to get the next number. Counting down means you take a number and subtract 1 to get the next number. But infinity plus 1 is still infinity, and the same for infinity minus 1. If we meet someone who's been counting from infinity for an infinite amount of time, he ain't never going to get down to any finite numbers. He's just going to be counting infinity, 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 so on forever. And that means this example ain't mathematically possible. And notice I ain't saying that infinity itself is necessarily impossible. There's just certain things you can't do with infinity due to the nature of infinity. And that's different from saying that infinity can't exist. It's like there's certain places you can't get to by car, but that don't mean the cars don't exist. Anyways, the main point here is that, once again, Dr. Craig's argument is based on ignorance of how advanced math works. So either Dr. Craig himself don't understand how it works, or else he's deliberately taking advantage of other folks' ignorance. But either way, this argument is a big old failure. And here's his summary of why the past can't be infinite. Quote, since the series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another, it can't be actually infinite. It must have had a beginning. So we have a second good argument for premise 2 of the Kalam cosmological argument that the universe began to exist. End quote. And considering that the scientific evidence indicates that, in fact, time is finite in the past, these philosophical arguments is largely moot besides being generally fallacious. But this is a good time to remember, once again, that what Dr. Craig is arguing here is that it's impossible for anything to have been around since eternity past due to the nature of the past. And ironically, that means that God himself must have a beginning by Dr. Craig's own logic and definitions. And that is deliciously ironic. But that's one of the drawbacks of trying to make claims that ain't true. The harder you work to try and make them sound consistent with objective reality, the harder it is to avoid contradicting yourself. The contradiction is baked into the false claim because being inconsistent with reality is what makes the claim false. And you can't take one false claim and make it consistent with reality by adding more false claims. The only reliable way to come to true, self-consistent conclusions is to make objective reality itself, and not any stories told by man, your infallible standard of truth. You can holler inspired word of God all you want, but at the end of the day, objective reality is what dictates what's true and what ain't, at least for any definition of truth worth having. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to get into Dr. Craig's attempt to appeal to science in order to prove his claims, which, considering the mess he made of the mathematics, is likely to be interesting. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.